Hey guys, welcome back to Let's Talk About It with Jackie and Megan. We are here today to talk about priestly celibacy and I guess kind of celibacy in general, but mostly focused on priests and ministers and pastors specifically. So, this was something that we got in the comments when we mentioned it was a possible topic. Some people wanted to hear it. And it's something I feel like we've wanted to talk about.
Yeah, ever since we did the episode on like priesthood versus priesthood of all believers, I felt like it was just kind of a natural extension of that conversation because it is so uh characteristic of like the Western, like Roman Catholic Church. So,
Yeah, I also think there are a lot of misconceptions about it, even amongst Catholics. So I'm excited to dive into that today. So, Megan, do you kind of want to talk about just the difference between like maybe the Latin Western Rite, Eastern Rite, and then Protestant denominations? Just an overview of what is allowed.
yeah, and just like the different Christian traditions. So obviously we know in like the early church, many bishops and like monastic leaders voluntarily chose to be celibate. There were married clergy as well, though. And then the Latin or Western rite of the Catholic Church moved to requiring celibacy as a rule for clergy in the 11th century, instead of just encouraging it. Whereas the Eastern rite of the Catholic Church allows for married men to become priests, but priests cannot marry. If that makes sense. And married men who become priests cannot become bishops. This is sort of similar to like the Eastern Orthodox Church, where they allow priests to marry. So even if you are currently a priest and you're single, you can get married, but bishops are celibate. And then you have Protestant denominations, which I would say Protestant denominations overwhelmingly allow for married pastors. And in fact, I would say it almost goes to the other extreme of they view it as ideal or preferred for a pastor to be married. I know there's definitely context where like a single pastor would be viewed with suspicion almost, which is wrong, but it's sort of like the other end of that spectrum.
The cultures are very different.
Yes.
Just a funny
Yeah.
thing, one time I went to a Catholic school growing up, and but my teacher was Greek Orthodox, my fourth grade teacher. And I'm like fourth, I don't know anything. And she's talking about how her husband is a priest. And I'm like, what? What are you talking about, girl? Just because my concept of priest was single. And it was just funny because, of course, yes, as it also is in the Eastern Catholic rite, Eastern Orthodox priests are allowed to marry. So my little brain just could not understand that in fourth grade.
I
Um,
remember when I we worked at the nonprofit in Chicago where we met, our pregnancy center. I was at one of the maternity homes, and they had a priest in the area who would come and say mass in the chapel at the maternity home. And he was an older gentleman who he had been married, he had had kids. His wife had actually passed away, and after his wife passed away, he became a priest. So he became a priest much later in life. And so he had children, and he would, in his homilies, sometimes as illustrations, talk about his children. And people would be like, wait, what? Like they would get so like creeped out because they'd be like, a priest that has children? Like what? And so the maternity home director would have to explain to everyone, like, by the way, like he was married, his wife passed away, and then he became a priest. Like it was in that progression of things. But I remember just thinking it was funny because I thought nothing of it. Like in his homily when he was talking about his kids, I was like, oh yeah, because I was just like used
used
to
to
that.
it, yeah.
Yeah. And then afterwards, people were like, that was so confusing. I was like, wait, what? And I was like, oh, right, he's Catholic.
That's funny. Yeah, that does happen. It's also, yeah, very common that we'll be focusing on the priesthood, but there are women who take vows of celibacy and
Yeah.
enter in religious orders, or just lay women. There's consecrated virginity. You can choose to do that as well. Um, and I know I had a professor, his mom, yeah, like her husband had died, her kids were all like much older, and she was like, I'm out. She joined a cloistered order. She felt called. So yeah,
Oh my.
yeah. Um, which honestly, sometimes I'm like, I wish I was called to that because they're just away from the world praying and dang. But it's, as we're going
Gardening
to
and
talk
stuff.
about, celibacy is a calling and it's something that you do voluntarily. In both traditions, although what you can and cannot do. But honestly, I feel like sometimes we're talking about apples and oranges because the role of the priesthood, like the ones that have on restrictions of you need to be you to join the highest level of priesthood, you take vows of celibacy. You choose to do that to in order to join and become a priest. And then if you're in the Eastern Rite, if you want to escalate to be maybe become a bishop or higher up, um, I feel like sometimes we're talking about apples and oranges because like the role of the priesthood in Catholic and in Eastern Orthodox is so distinct from the role of a pastor in a Protestant church, which we won't get into too much today, but like that came up a lot in my mind. Like
Hmm.
they are just also different things. But anyway, so obviously the Catholic Church upholds priestly celibacy as an ideal, even in the Eastern Church, which we can get into more. Um, a married man can become a priest, but he cannot rise up higher and become a bishop or, maybe pope one day, which is also a bishop. Um, so why does the Catholic Church still today uphold priestly celibacy as an ideal? Um, so, the Catholic view on celibacy, of course, begins with the celibate example of Jesus Christ. And I'm going to read the Catechism explanation because that is like the most recent explanation directly from the Church. So, all ordained ministers of the Latin Church, with the exception of permanent deacons, so you can have permanent deacons in the church, which they're married, they have families, and you'll see them also next to the priest saying Mass sometimes at certain churches are normally chosen from among men of faith who live a celibate life and who intend to remain celibate for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, which comes from Matthew. Jesus had used this phrasing. They are called to consecrate themselves with undivided heart to the Lord and to the affairs of the Lord. They give themselves entirely to God and to men. Celibacy is a sign of this new life to the service of which the church's minister is consecrated. Accepted with a joyous heart, celibacy radiantly proclaims in the reign of God. And I'm going from Matthew 11 through 12, where Jesus says, not all can accept this word, but only to those whom it is granted. Some are, we're saying, incapable of marriage for how they were born. And he goes on, but some renounce marriage for the sake of the kingdom of God. Whoever can accept this ought to accept it. And that's again Matthew 19:11 through 12. And the church sees celibacy, whether you're a priest or you choose celibacy as a layperson or consecrated as a woman, as an eschatological sign to the church, a living out in the present of the universal celibacy of heaven. And it says in Matthew 22 through 30, for in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. So theology of the body talks about this a lot, like those who choose to live celibate, because it is not the ordinary thing. It is not like we wouldn't call it the natural thing, but we call it supernatural, that they are given this grace and have this specific calling from God to live in a way that is not natural. We think all on our natural level, we are born to reproduce, like we have a sex drive, we have this innate need for community and for partnership that is very normal. I think every human being has felt that. Um, to this supernatural call, because in heaven, we are fully devoted to the Lord, we are not married. And it's, yes, so it's like they are already living that and they are witness to us here on earth. For those, most of us will be called to marriage and we'll pursue that. So, yes, inspired by Jesus' example, certain Christian men and women, in obedience to a divine vocation, take this promise to renounce marriage. Um, Saint Ignatius of Antioch talked about this. He says, for the honor of God, he wrote a letter to Polycarp, tell my sisters to love the Lord and to be content with their husbands in the flesh and the spirit, and recommend my brothers to love their wives as the Lord loved the church. If any of them can persevere in chastity and honor of the Lord's flesh, let them do so without boasting about it, which is very similar to what kind of what Jesus said. So yeah, I kind of just said a lot. I think most Christians, knowing the Bible, that St. Paul talks a lot about marriage and celibacy. He himself was, we think, was celibate. There were, of course, though, which we agree on, the first pope was married. St. Peter was married. Amongst the apostles, it was kind of some were married, some were not. It was a choice that they would make. But Paul talks a lot about in First Corinthians um, just how that married people are often caught up in the anxieties of the world, whereas celibate people can fully devote themselves to the Lord. And so that's something that we look to. So he says in First Corinthians 7:32 through 35, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the affairs of the Lord, how to please the Lord, but the married man is anxious about worldly affairs, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. On the unmarried woman or girl is anxious about the affairs of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit, but the married woman is anxious how to please her husband. I say this for your benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord, so that he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do better. Um, so he's not really saying that marriage is bad. I think we can both agree that marriage is good. I mean, I think Catholics have like the highest view of marriage, that it is a sacrament, is good, as we'll say, like it's what most of us are called to. So it's not degrading the view of marriage. I think most of us are called to it, but for those that have a very specific call, and I think most well suits the priesthood, is to be fully undivided. But we can get into that more later about like the just the practicalities of being unmarried. Um, but something that's really interesting to me, and I've never fully understood, was most Protestant traditions, pastors are married, and it is like it's very rare to see celibacy talked about in Protestant circles. So, Megan, can
Yeah.
you kind of talk about that and the theological um, reasoning behind that as well?
Yeah, I would say like the Protestant counter argument at its best would be that the Bible allows for married clergy, and so celibacy should be a personal choice, not a church mandate. I do think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of Protestant churches have sort of swung a little too far. Um, and so I'll talk about this a little later, but a large part of the Reformation too was the recentering of marriage and family in the Christian life and that emphasis. And that's a good thing, a wonderful thing, and it really did shape our Western society to center the family. However, I do think there is sort of a suspicion or hesitancy towards single people, people who feel called to singleness, people who feel called to celibacy in Protestant circles, which is unfortunate because I do think it is a legitimate calling. We see Paul talk about that was his personal calling. And um, I know just from my experience in Protestant circles outside of maybe like missionaries to dangerous areas, it was very rare for someone to like declare that was their calling.
Hmm.
There was one church I visited when I first moved to Chicago where the senior pastor was single. And I remember that was like, whoa, what? Like shocking. I'd never experienced that. And I just remember from conversations with some of my fellow classmates, they found that concerning. They were like, oh, that's really concerning. Like, what if he starts like dating someone in the church, like all this stuff, like it just raised all these questions. And they were like, it's a lot better for him to be married. And I remember even talking to friends at Moody who were in like pastoral degrees. There was a lot of pressure put on them to get married before like entering the pastorate because it was a lot harder for them to find pastoral jobs as a single man. So that's just sort of an interesting distinction between like
Interesting. I didn't
probably
know.
like the Catholic culture and like the Protestant culture is it's
Huh.
very much viewed as the ideal or the norm for pastoral leadership to be married. So I that like I could go on and on about that. That's just like a very interesting thing. But if I take the Protestant argument at its best and we don't take the extreme example of almost overemphasizing marriage or viewing it as better than singleness, I would say that it's that celibacy should just be a personal choice, but it's not like a requirement for the office of the clergy. So, the biblical stance on that would be looking at scripture passages that talk about the qualifications for church leaders, such as First Timothy 3:2 or Titus 1:6, where they describe church leaders as being the husband of one wife. Now, obviously, that is emphasizing, a man who is above reproach, who is married to one woman, who is faithful, who is not an adulterer. But what that suggests is that a lot of early Christian leaders were married, and it was sort of expected and certainly not forbidden for that role. You mentioned Peter being married, which is talked about in Matthew 8:14, Mark 1:30, Luke 4:38. So we see Peter being, the cornerstone of the early church. Even if we don't consider him to be the first pope, certainly like the main primary role in establishing the church in Jerusalem, him being married as an example of a married leader. And then Paul acknowledges that Jesus's brothers were married in 1 Corinthians 9:5, and even mentions other apostles being married. So it's the understanding that since there was marriage amongst the apostles in the early church, that marriage or married status was not a barrier to leadership. We would also point to like the Old Testament Levitical priesthood. They were not required to be celibate. Marriage was seen as a blessing and not an obstacle to serving God, and they all were married and had families. So we look to that example as well, that the office of the clergy is not separate from the lay people in the sense that they are still allowed to and welcome to marry. You brought up Paul's teaching on celibacy in 1 Corinthians 7 through 9, or 32 through 35. And we would say in this passage, Paul makes it clear that marriage is a gift from God and that celibacy is not for everyone, which we would agree that celibacy is not, a gift that given to everyone. He also warns against imposing unnecessary restrictions, saying that forbidding marriage is the doctrine of demons in 1 Timothy 4:1 through 3, when done for the wrong reasons. And so we would look at the Catholic Church as taking Paul's personal preference for celibacy in his ministry, which was a very dangerous, harrowing ministry. I mean, he was stoned a few times, he was imprisoned often. Like, it makes sense that that would be his calling to not have a family, and making that a universal requirement for the office of the clergy, which we would say is not present in that passage being a command. And then I can go into this a little more later, but once again, the Reformation recentering marriage and family. So just the looking at marriage as a God ordained institution that is not um, unavailable to the clergy. So marriage is natural, it's God ordained, it's established in Genesis as part of God's plan for humanity. Genesis 2:18, it's not good for man to be alone. And we even see it as beneficial for personal holiness and ministry. So we would actually say that a lot of pastors who are married, that's actually a benefit to them. It can strengthen their ministry. Um, if it's the normal state for most people, it shouldn't be forbidden from the clergy, who also need support and companionship just as much as lay people do. And we would view it as an artificial restriction to say that all clergy must remain celibate rather than that being a biblical requirement. And I think we can both agree, we were just talking about this before we hit record, that a lot of church fathers had sort of some wacky views on sex, which is not representative of the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church now. But I think that definitely influenced a lot of different teachings, and especially like the medieval era. And so a lot of early church fathers wrongfully viewed sexual abstinence or virginity as a higher form of holiness. And so the Reformation tried to counter that as well and recenter the family in the Christian life. So I think that would be a concise Protestant argument on why celibacy shouldn't be required.
And throughout like the Catholic history, so I think a misconception also is that it's priestly celibacy is a doctrine or a dogma, which it is not, which that shows by that priests, there's a difference between the Eastern tradition and the Western tradition, that priests can married men can become priests in the Eastern Rite. And then um even just the fact that after the Second Vatican Council, there's now this like um very encouraged office of the permanent deacon, which they can be married. So that was more of a development that was heavily encouraged in churches, which I've seen actually in most churches now that I've been in. Um, that throughout history, and also just the fact that there were married apostles and all of that. So we would never say it's intrinsic to the nature of a priest. It's a we would call it discipline, and I guess kind of in the tradition, lowercase t tradition, that priests that to be in the office you take these vows of celibacy. And it's interesting because I feel like um most people think like, oh, from the very beginning. I don't know. There's just like a big misconception that like this is something that can never change in the church, or this is
Mm.
something. Do I think it's something that will? Not really. But also like the Pope has allowed those that have converted from Orthodoxy to like become Catholic priests. So they were already married, and then he's allowed them to convert and then become into the priesthood. I actually know someone that I don't know, he was a pastor in a Protestant church and then he converted to Catholicism, and he was allowed to actually become a priest, and he had a family and all of that. So that's even on the Western side of the church. Like I see married priests sometimes. A little more rare. Um, but throughout history, we see that clerical celibacy was encouraged very early on. And this was something that there was a lot of development and like disagreement about, um, that they were encouraged to be celibate, but some of them would have families. I don't know. When I was reading the history, it was very much something that kind of developed and changed and people argued about throughout time. And like you said, Megan, I think it wasn't until the was it the 11th century? I always forget that it
I
was
think that's when it
really,
was like established.
yeah,
Yeah.
established as a discipline in at least the Western church that you take vows, you choose, if you choose to become a priest, you take vows of celibacy. And I don't see it as something that's like forced upon them, because they very much they take a lot of time and discernment to decide if they want to become a priest, and maybe not just if they feel called to ministry as a man, not to be a deacon, which
Mm.
also allows them to do a lot in ministry and a lot in church and still be a married man. Um, so I don't really see it as something like forced upon men, because it's still something I think we both would agree is something that we see in scripture. It needs to be voluntary, and it's something that you feel a very specific calling to be celibate, and that most people are not called to it. It's a supernatural calling. Um, because priests take up to 7 years before they take their final vows, and they are totally and willfully making this calling to celibacy. And all priests I know, they felt this calling to celibacy. And it takes 7 years to finally get there. So I see it as more of like it's something that they are choosing to do. Um, yeah, and they don't feel called to marriage. They feel like this is their calling to be celibate. So um, I don't know. Yeah, it just was interesting to hear that language of like I feel like people think it could be like forced upon them. It's like, no, this is very much a decision that they are making and they feel called to. And that's what when I've talked to my friends that are priests or becoming priests. Um, and like I said, even in the culture, it's funny, there's is such a distinction between like the vocation of marriage and the vocation of priesthood within
Mm.
Catholic circles. And like I just feel like the priesthood is very something, the office of the priesthood is something very different. And we've talked about this like than it is in Protestant theology. But that's a whole other thing that I don't really feel like getting into in this episode. Um, but
We
all
did
that
do
to
an episode on
say,
that, so that's
yeah, it's a whole
for
other thing. But all that to say that there was a lot of disagreement. It's not something that's intrinsic to the nature of the priesthood, though. Like that is something that in special circumstances has been changed. That is very much a discipline in the
Mhm.
Catholic Church. And I know a lot of permanent deacons that basically do a lot of the same things that maybe a pastor would do in a Protestant church, but they're permanent deacons in the Catholic Church. And they are allowed to, and I say permanent because usually on the way to becoming a priest, you're a deacon for a year or so, and then you're take holy orders and fully become a priest. But you can permanently be a deacon, and still be a minister in the Catholic Church and be married and have family. Um, so that's kind of the history is just kind of all over the place. There's a lot of disagreement, there's a lot of changes, and there was a whole thing of like if you're married, you should maybe not have sex with your wife. if you're in a higher ministry, and then that changed. They're like, no, we should never require, like the Pope, there was a Pope that came out and said we should not require men that are already married to not have sex with their wives if they're priests, and like whatever. And John Paul II talks about that a lot because Paul talks about, he kind of uses the language that like maybe that being celibate is a higher calling.
Mhm.
And that was kind of taken on in circles in theology of the body. John Paul II really tries to like emphasize that both are equally will lead to holiness, and like you shouldn't be, God's calling most of us to marriage. So that's the most holy thing you can do, is to, pursue marriage, get married, and that is a sacrament. It's a very high view of marriage in the Catholic Church. And yeah, it's not better. You're not better or more holy. I think that what makes you most holy is choosing what you feel called to, obeying the Lord and what you are called to.
Mhm.
So we both would agree that marriage is good. And I mean, I'm choosing to pursue marriage. I don't feel called to be celibate, and I don't think that makes me less holy. So yeah, that's also a whole
I
other
think that's
thing.
where a lot of the difficulty with this conversation comes in because obviously this like original conversation of, you know, like countering priestly celibacy came about in the Reformation in the Middle Ages, and we would both acknowledge there was a ton of corruption going on during that time in the church. That is not representative of true Catholic doctrine or views, and is also not representative like the modern current Catholic Church and practice. So it's hard because I can understand for a lot of the reformers what they were up against, and why they would react so strongly against this. Whereas now it's a little harder because when you look at, like you're saying, like, yes, priests are feeling this calling, they're choosing this. That's a lot different than like the corruption that was going on in the Middle Ages. And so I think it definitely has shaped a lot of these conversations, and maybe what makes it hard, like a lot of Catholics and Protestants talk past each other because we've both sort of overcorrected further from each other.
Yeah, there's a, yeah. Mhm.
And so it's hard because when you look at like, what the Reformation was arguing against at the time, there was a lot of corruption in the church. Even just like financial corruption. Like the church had a lot of control over priests because they weren't allowed to have families, and they couldn't, have heirs and such. And just the structure of their society at the time was just so much different than ours. And so a lot of Martin Luther's writings, or like Melanchthon or other reformers, when they're speaking out against celibacy, it's largely against the corruption or abuse that was going on. So I think Protestantism can learn from Catholicism in how you value celibacy, and view that as a legitimate calling, because I do think there tends to be an overcorrection in Protestantism, like I said earlier, where people who choose to have a celibate lifestyle or are called to singleness are viewed sort of with suspicion, or, well, we don't want them in leadership because they'll be more prone to temptation, like as if marriage makes you not prone to temptation, or if marriage stops you
Mhm.
from, and we know that's not true because
Yeah.
there are plenty of stories of, you know, Protestant pastors who are married and like abuse occurring and adultery occurring. So marriage does not stop that. And so even just as I was doing some research on this, I struggle because a lot of the arguments I think coming from Protestants are like, oh, the reason there are sexual abuse scandals in the Catholic Church is because they force these poor men to not have sex. And it's like, that is not, no, that's not true. Um, so yeah, I think that's even just an important conversation to have too, is, that marriage does not stop abuse from occurring.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Because that's something that not Protestants, but just lay people that, or not lay people, but secular people, which because they worship sex and there's an overemphasis on like you need sex to be fulfilled. And that's something that we all would reject as Christians. But yes, that they would say, oh, it's because these men are celibate, which just is not true. And I think is such a gross accusation to make, and just yeah,
Yeah.
it's just false, because I think sexual perversion comes from deep wounds and deep issues and sin in our culture, which unfortunately, like I've had married friends that have had issues with like there's things that happen in marriage. Oof, yeah. That I just don't think that that's I think the root of it all that is from deep wounds, sin, which is a pervades after the fall all of our culture. And that's something that, yeah, we both would agree. And I think that's just kind of an attack on chastity in general, because if
Right.
you never get married, even if you're not feeling the specific calling, like you're called to be chaste, and both sides would agree on that. So it's like, oh, you're just going to act out just because like you never got married, or I don't know, like then that kind
Yeah.
of forces you into marriage. And I think actually both sides like has an overemphasis on marriage and like how that's the only way you can be fulfilled. And I see that even in Catholic circles are like, yeah, this overemphasis on sex being the fulfillment, which is just not true. Yeah, so that's something that I think a lot of Christians, Protestant and Catholic, would push against.
Yeah.
But
There's also
that
something I was thinking about too in like Protestant circles specifically. The argument is that, there are men called to pastoral leadership that are not called to celibacy.
hmm,
Whereas like the Catholic would say, if you're called to the priesthood, you're called to celibacy. Like those come hand in hand. Um, at least in like your context. Like you were talking about your friends who have been called to be priests, but felt very strongly too that along with that they were called to a life of celibacy.
yeah, so that's
Um,
currently who it's attracting, the priesthood. Yeah.
yeah. But as I was thinking about it, I was like, okay, where, in Protestant circles, often people who are called to celibacy or called to singleness are sort of viewed as like, oh, what? Like that's not seen as like
Or
as
you said they're
legitimate or as
missionaries,
valid.
like they choose to pursue being a
Sure.
missionary.
It's
Yeah.
like a very specific, like, oh, but if you're just like living your life out in the world, you got a normal job, people assume that you want to be married and that you are called to marriage as sort of the default. But on the other hand, we would acknowledge like people who struggle with same-sex attraction are not called to live into that. And, we would not hold to like homosexual marriage. So, clearly celibacy should be a legitimate calling. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, well, is it possible for God to call a man to pastoral ministry who also has a struggle with same sex attraction and therefore feels called to celibacy? Yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, I fear that in a lot of Protestant churches, he would be unable to be in a form of leadership. And that's really sad. And I think that that is something that needs to change, that there's like this suspicion around singleness, especially with men. They're just seen as like, oh, men can't control themselves unless they have a wife. You know what I mean? And that's not good. And that's not holy and that is not Christian. And so as much as I don't think that the pastoral role is one that needs to be celibate, I also think that the Protestant side has overcorrected to requiring marriage almost.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about is not even like theological differences. It's just, even throughout history, it's this tradition, this culture around the office that has kind of shaped and changed
Yeah.
even the disciplines or the just ideas around and what's encouraged, which I think is really interesting. Yeah, I think so for me, it something that I love about Catholicism is this like theology and writing around um consecrated virginity and this tradition that's even coming more back for women that are lay people, not even they don't feel called to join an order, but just consecrate themselves. I have a friend who is currently going through the process of living as a lay woman, but being a consecrated virgin and taking those vows is just like, yeah, this beauty away from that sex is not what fulfills you. Obviously, if you're in marriage, which Catholics, we're all about having babies and having sex. If you're married, like great. You should do that. Actually, you can't really be fully married until you have sex and consummate the marriage. So I'm very happy that as a tradition and as like our culture has gotten away from this purity culture around sex and it being bad. But like I love this view of like it is an eschatological witness to the world. I look at celibate people and I think, wow, they're really showing the world that to be happy, you don't need to have sex. It's really fully in Jesus, which in marriage, that's something that we need to realize because sex is not what's going to make your marriage work or make your marriage um outlast hard times or like really keep you together. It's that eschatological view of like, this is what's leading us to heaven. This is my vocation that's leading me to heaven. But our focus, the center of our marriage needs to be Christ, not sex, not whatever. And so there's such a witness. Like the most joyful people I've met are, even specifically in my life, religious women that are not having sex. They don't even have the office of the priesthood. Like they're consecrating the Eucharist and like doing these sacraments and all of this. Like they are so fulfilled and they're such a witness to me even as a single woman in the world that feels called to marriage, like, okay, sex is not what's going to fix things for me, or being married, having this partner, like, it's a beautiful thing and it does make you holy. Marriage makes you holy if that's what you're called to, but it's not, that's not the center of things. So I really love this theology around like they are such a witness, such an eschatological, which eschatological basically means like theology around heaven, so pointing to heaven. I don't know, I just kept saying that word. Like people know.
Eschatology. Yep.
Eschatology, it's something John Paul II really talks about this a lot. He uses that word a lot in Theology of the Body, about how both are supposed to be toward that, marriage and religious life,
Hmm.
but there's such a prominent witness of that because they're living as these lay people, consecrating themselves, their body, their sexuality, everything fully to the Lord, and saying like, I'm going to go above and beyond, like supernaturally, and I'm not going to have a partner, even though that's what naturally as humans we are, our bodies are kind of like called to, you know?
Yeah.
So I love that theology around that. And I found like the most beautiful witnesses in those people. And I do think it's something that I hope like Protestants embrace more, even if like obviously they're not going to embrace like the priesthood or maybe not religious orders, but I don't think it's outside of the theology of Protestantism to kind of emphasize or like have more not such a suspicion around that or like kind of
Mm.
acknowledge that as a calling. And I think in time we could see that. Like I said, these things change. Like to be a celibate as a priest is not within the doctrine or dogma. And we'll talk about this a little more later, but there's been discussions of like in areas of the world where there's low amounts of priests, like could we allow married
Mm.
priests to become bishops to, yeah, I don't know. We'll see. I don't know what's going to change in that way. Um, but something else I think we can talk about is, does celibacy leave you, does it help you in ministry? Is it an asset to ministry, or is it something that is a barrier in your full ministry? And I think that's also something that I personally do think, and this is what the church, why the church made this a discipline. I do think specifically in the office of the priesthood, taking holy orders, what like the priest is called to, I do think, and I kind of this goes back to what Paul said, I do think it is ideal if they are unmarried. And the church talks about this because, and I even just thinking about it practically, like what a priest is called to is to be fully there and present for their, not even capital C church, but for their specific church. And in the middle of the night, if they need to go out and give last rites or be with someone as they're dying, they're supposed to be on call all the time. And so they're supposed to be fully dedicated. And that's like in holy orders, you're almost like consecrating yourself and like marrying the church, is kind of how they would say it. And so you're fully giving yourself and your time for prayer, for to be with your people, to be with your church. And I think that if you're married, and the office of the priesthood, while it's not outside of the realm of possibility and also not in our dogma or doctrine, it is not barred from that happening. You are split because you should, as a married man, have your family kind of at the top of your responsibility. Like if your child is sick and dying, you should be with your child, even if someone in your parish calls you and says, like, oh, I need you to come. Well, you should be with your child. That's just how it is. And I think that it does give men this openness and this freeness to really be there for his people. And that's kind of what they know they're signing up for when they become a priest. And that's why when they enter holy orders, they know that this is what they're doing and what they're dedicating themselves to. Um, so I don't know. I could go back to, I already read this, First Corinthians, like I want you to be free from anxieties, and the unmarried man is anxious about the affairs of the Lord, how to please the Lord. Um, so and so on and so forth, that how married men are anxious about their family and their wives, which they should be. They should have that at the top of their priorities. And celibate life, which deprives the priest of conjugal intimacy and fatherhood in the physical order, allows him to give himself more completely to looking after other people, to their salvation, their sanctification. And we emphasize a lot like spiritual fatherhood and motherhood and having no exclusive love. The celibate priest ought always to be at the disposal of all and has the time and inner freedom to serve his neighbor, for however it be in charity. So that's why even I personally think that priests, it's ideal for them to remain celibate while it is not theologically like in the nature of having to be celibate. Yeah. But I know that and also I just think I don't know, I think the role of the priesthood in the Catholic Church is different than even what pastors are required to do in a Protestant church. So I think that even change is like I don't know. I think that that makes a difference in my mind why I think that Catholic priests it's ideal for them to be celibate. I don't know if like the role of how pastors act in Protestant churches, if it's necessarily ideal that they be celibate versus married. I don't know.
What do you see as different practically in the role? Because like visiting the sick or like
Yeah.
that's all present in the pastoral role as well.
Yes. I think because in the priesthood, they have this like they are the ones that distribute the sacraments and lay people cannot do that. And like there's even this distinction in like what they can give, like the last rites and such. Like they have a very specific like way they're representing Jesus in a way like they are in a very different way. Like there's an indelible mark left on their soul that distinguishes them from the lay people, which is not in Protestantism. So I just even think like just the role of priests, like they are there to give confessions, give last rites, like which is not something in the Protestant tradition in the same way, like the effectiveness we would see the priest's grace can have in people's lives. So it's like it's even more urgent for them to be there specifically, like to have a priest there in these ways. I don't know. Yeah, I'm just trying to think about that more, but just like I don't know. And maybe I don't know enough about the role of the pastor as well. I haven't had a lot of like experience with that. But it does feel different. And maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
I don't know either. It was just something I was thinking of when you were talking because like the role a Protestant pastor has is still a taxing one. It is
Oh,
like
for
there's
sure.
a lot,
For sure.
when it comes to like hospital visits, funerals, weddings, counseling, visiting
Oh, sure.
shut-ins, and even like specifically in like the Lutheran tradition, most of the time it is the pastor doing those things, bringing communion to shut-ins and such. So I don't know if practically on a day to day it looks much different, like duty wise. I think perhaps the difference would be structurally in the church. Most Protestant churches have multiple leaders in one church, so that work can sort of be distributed, where maybe in a lot of Catholic parishes, it does fall primarily on one priest.
It's like two,
Um, yeah,
usually. Yeah.
yeah. Whereas most churches have like boards of elders, deacons, and pastors. So maybe that could be where the difference lies and why it can be easier for a Protestant pastor to balance like family life and ministry because there are others to share the load. And for me, I would see that as ideal. I would see that as ideal because I think marriage does um, it does give a pastor a life experience that can help him minister to others. And so I don't think that like harms his ministry. I think it can really help. And I also think because ministry can be very isolating, that having companionship and partnership that is sanctifying and holy, that such as marriage, is extremely beneficial for pastors. So that's why I would lean more towards seeing that as the ideal.
Yeah. I think I just, yeah, I really just like the way the Catholics designate like you're marrying your spouse and fully dedicating yourself. That's your top priority versus kind of like in holy orders, like fully consecrating yourself and almost like marrying the church, like they use that language, the bridegroom of Christ. And just that like you are fully giving yourself to the parish and all of their needs and even just like your inner spiritual life, like what it frees you up from. And I do kind of think Paul like really outlines that well. So I do think that's why I think it would be more ideal for there to be single men in the priesthood in that role. Yeah, I think that that just makes most sense to me. And obviously, like I said, it's not restricted to that. That could one day change because there are like, and I think, yeah, even as you get higher up into being a bishop, I think there's a lot of wisdom in that being restricted to celibate men, just so they can more fully give themselves to that office. And then all the way up to the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. Um, but yeah, it's just, yeah, it's interesting to hear the different views on that. And I do think that's why I think it's also very beneficial for married people to be involved in the ministry of the church as well, because I do think you have a good point that there should be married people as well. Like, I think help ministering or like giving advice to the lay people because, like a deacon, a married deacon or such, because they have this
Mm,
perspective or this advice that they can give. And I do think that like loneliness is can be a problem within the priesthood. And that is why it is ideal for there to be community for priests. I think that is very essential. And that I think has been in certain like cultures like not emphasized enough. But there is this like spiritual reality we would see as Catholics that they have this like special like union with Christ in being priests that they should really lean into that and in
mm,
that prayer and in that to fulfill kind of like those things they're not that like conjugal love use the word conjugal they're not receiving in marriage like that community even just like what you receive in sex which is a good and holy thing to be fully immersed in prayer and like having that kind of union with Christ that I think really does it's a different calling, but I think it is a certain type of unity with Christ that you not different, not better, but different that kind of helps fulfill the human person because it is the supernatural calling. And I've heard people that are take vows of celibacy. My friend, who she felt like, yeah, this very special like union with Christ. Because for me, I don't feel that calling. I'm like, how would you not get lonely? How would like that feels crazy to
mm,
me, but that's because I'm not called to it. That God really does fulfill in a way like that loneliness.
mm.
But yeah, I don't know. That's something I've thought about a lot. It feels crazy to me. I couldn't even imagine like fully pursuing that. Like I don't know what's gonna happen in my
Yeah.
life, but just fully like, oh, I'm not even gonna look for a partner. I'm just gonna
Hmm.
I'm not called to that, I'll tell you that. At least now in my life, I don't think so. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, there was this quote. It just emphasized like the bridegroom's voice, which I'll leave a link below. There's like a it's on the Vatican website actually, the theological basis for priestly celibacy. And it talks a lot about just like the theological nature of like being united to the bridegroom in a different way and so on and so forth. But yeah, something else I did want to talk about is that I do think throughout the tradition of the church, marriage has been looked down on. And so that's why I think it is good that, especially after the Second Vatican Council and Pope John Paul II emphasized how good marriage is and that it is not lesser than a vocation of celibacy. And I think that that's something that, like you said, maybe Protestantism had an influence in the culture of like emphasizing that that is important because I think if you look at Catholic culture now, for sure, that's very emphasized.
Hmm.
If not seen as like, honestly, we have the same issues in our church where it's like if you're just single and you're either not pursuing priesthood or your or religious life and you are just single, like there's a little bit of like they can look down on you, um, which I think is also unfortunate.
Hmm.
And like, well, if you're not pursuing religious life, you better get married. You need to get married or you're not fully yourself. You're not fully human. And I don't know. Yeah, I've heard that language before, which I
Yeah.
think is BS. And I think John Paul II does speak against that, even though I think some
Hmm.
people misinterpret him. But I think that's an issue we have as well. um,
Yeah. And like you said, even too, like Christ himself was not married. So clearly, um, although I would say marriage is the natural way we are created,
sure.
um, like that we see in Genesis and is instituted by God, it
Yeah.
is certainly not required. Um,
Mhm.
and so I think that's why I really lean towards marriage is a personal calling between you and the Lord, and celibacy is a personal calling between you and the Lord. And I think that's why personally I wouldn't see it as something that should be mandated for any
Mhm.
role or office.
Mhm.
either way, which is why I think it's also unfortunate that it is so hard for Protestant young men who are single and feel called to singleness to have any form of pastoral leadership.
Mm.
I've talked to friends who struggled with that, who saw like like significantly more doors open up once they were married.
I wonder if churches they do worry about, which like this is something I would think, like if they don't feel this full calling to celibacy, like there's a single man in a church, if it would be awkward if then the pastor were like giving time to dating or I don't know. Yeah, like that's also a thing that I'm like, I kind of can see how that would be.
Right. And I also can see where like dating someone in the congregation that could be problematic as well because you are technically in like spiritual authority over them and leadership. So yeah, I think there's legitimate concerns as well. I do think that someone who is currently single but is not called to singleness is different than someone who like is called to singleness.
Oh yeah.
And sometimes we don't have that distinction.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah.
We kind of view like anyone who's single as a temporary state.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like that's a good segue to kind of address a little bit more the like moral or scandal prevention argument
Mm.
of celibacy because I think that's somewhere where you and I would both agree that that is a very weak argument. Um, that saying the the scandals or abuse that have occurred like institutionally in the Catholic Church in the past are directly related to the fact that priests are celibate. And I find that a very unfortunate argument that is made. Um, and sort of in a way humorous because there's a lot of scandal and abuse cases in Protestant churches and institutions and structures that have all been married men. Um, so I just think it's important to like put that in this episode because I know that is something that people say that like celibacy or mandating that is somehow causing this abuse. Um, that like sexual abuse is not about sexual frustration solely. It's a very disordered view of sexuality and abuse, I would say, is more of like a widespread societal issue. It's not just present in Christian communities.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's interesting that studies have shown actually that the rates of sexual abuse by public school teachers are comparable or even higher to those of Catholic priests. And yet we sort of have this cultural understanding of like priests being, you know, more abusive when in reality that's not the case. I think this is a societal issue. This is something that is occurring, that children are not safe and that abuse is happening. And that's not something unique to Catholicism. That is
Yeah.
present in every system and structure. And so, because it's not unique to Catholicism, I don't think we can link it to celibacy. Um, and also, yeah, marriage doesn't guarantee that a person won't commit sexual abuse. Um, a lot of sexual offenders are actually married and have families,
Yeah.
and it doesn't prevent their predatory behavior or make it better. I think viewing marriage as a way to quell a sexual degeneracy is very harmful because it can also lead to abuse of the person they're married to. As a wife, you are not responsible to have sex with your husband so that he doesn't commit sexual crimes. That's not good. And I think conversations that lean towards that are very, very dangerous. And we need to get away from that. And so I thought it'd be interesting just to get your perspective too, because I
Yeah.
think we've even talked about this too, that because the priesthood is marked by celibacy, it may attract people who struggle with certain like intimacy issues or sexual identity. And so perhaps they feel drawn to the priesthood as like seeing it as a way to fix themselves.
It's not. Yeah. Not.
And it's not. And so unfortunately, I think that might be where more of that's coming in of people who feel very broken, who don't know how to get help going to the priesthood because they're thinking if I have this accountability, if I'm forced into this specific lifestyle, it'll make me better and easier. And that's not the case because what heals our brokenness is Jesus, not a system, and Catholics would agree. So yeah, I just found that interesting.
Yeah, I think that um there was a big emphasis on after there were all these scandals that came out of the Catholic Church really reforming their seminaries, and you have to
Mhm.
go through psychological evaluations and talk through like your sexual issues and really work through that. And if there's something seen as very significant in that way, just because you're not having sex, you know that if that sexual sin will come out in some way.
Yeah.
And like to be fully, we wouldn't say you can fully enter into either vocation, marriage, or if there's like some serious, serious issue there, like what would lead to sexually abusing someone, um, that you need to work through. And it doesn't bar you completely, like God can work through us, but that it needs to be worked through and healed before entering that vocation. Um, so I think that there's been a lot of cleanup. Also in seminaries, I'm really just emphasizing like really walking with a man through that before he makes a calling, or like seeing what are your motivations for becoming a priest, and that kind of thing to kind of mitigate those issues that we were seeing in seminaries and in churches. And I think that is a good point to make, because I think that's something within the just culture of Catholic churches that has had a very good shift. Um, and that, yeah, like becoming a priest is very serious, and you shouldn't become a priest if you wouldn't be a good father and a good husband. The virtues are
Yeah.
very similar. There's just that God is
Mhm.
calling you to use them in a different way. Um, yeah, that's always like the joke, because they'll see certain priests and like, wow, he would have been such a good husband and such a good father, like women saying, and they're like, well, yeah, that's good. He should have also been
Mhm.
very like been able to do that as well. He's just choosing and feeling called to go in this different direction, you know. So that's a really good point to bring up, I think.
I also think too, like in both contexts, Catholic and Protestant, the role of the clergy has an authority and leadership, and with that, a certain power. And
Mhm.
someone
Yeah.
who is struggling with a
Yeah.
tendency towards sexual abuse, a lot of times it involves power and opportunity, and we see this in Protestant, context as well. Like a lot of spiritual and sexual abuse that happens, the reason it hits so hard and is so difficult for people that experience that is because these people were spiritual fathers. They had this spiritual authority, and a lot of times it can warp our view of God. And unfortunately, I think sin, like that is the goal of sin. That is the goal of the devil, is to take these roles and twist them and use them to cause harm where they're supposed to cause healing. And
Yeah.
so, unfortunately, like I think that's why maybe some people who are struggling with some really deep sin would be attracted to this role, because it would give them the opportunity and it would give them the role that they are desiring, to have that power over someone. And so I think that's just important to note because, like you said, better screenings and processes in place can help prevent that. And I think that's something that even Protestant seminaries as well are doing better at more recently,
Yeah.
as these cases are becoming more out in the open, and not covered up. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, just important to note because it's good to have helpful conversations about that, not unhelpful ones.
Yeah. And yeah, these they need to be held accountable and put in the light. So not to kind of downplay the horribleness of those things, because yeah, I think priests even more, Catholic priests even more are held accountable. I even think for the sins that they do, because they were given such this out office, even from a Catholic view, like this power or this responsibility and this role of the priest in their sacrament of holy orders. That I think like Jesus talks about, those that have power over others are supposed to lead the young will be even more highly judged for leading those astray. So not to say like to lessen what these men have
Yeah,
done, because
exactly.
and those that hid what they did. Um but just to say like it's not the celibacy that's the issue, you know.
Right. Or the
Yeah.
causation.
Yeah, no. but they should be held responsible. And I think even more, I'm disappointed in them than I am in lay people that do these things, like, or
Mm.
non-Christians, even more. It's like, but yeah, even
Yeah.
more disgusting and disappointing.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I think the only other thing I wanted to touch on was just that there can be seen like, oh, the Eastern Catholics allow marriage, so it's almost like in contradiction of the Western Church. But just like to say that the Eastern Catholic Church also still cherishes and upholds celibacy.
Hmm.
And I think that's shown that the monastic life is held up as ideal in Eastern Catholicism as well, for both men and women. Monks are honored as spiritual mothers and fathers, and that's at the heart of Eastern Christian spirituality. And there's usually a strong monastic presence in the Eastern Catholic Church. And just that also in the Eastern Catholic Church, married men can be ordained as deacons and priests, but only celibate men are ordained to the episcopate, so can raise up higher. So there's just, yeah, not really like a tension between there, just the tradition is different.
Hmm.
And because, like I said, it's a discipline issue, not a doctrinal or dogma issue. So, yeah, that's something I
Yeah, I
just,
think that's a good distinction because it's something that
yeah,
I wouldn't have been aware of.
yeah,
And so it could definitely, as an outsider, be like super confusing. Like, well, why is it so important in this, right, but not in this one? And so, yeah, I think that's a great way to explain it.
yeah. Even for Catholics, they're like, no, priests can never be married, or they are taking the easy way out, or I don't know. Like a lot of will have judgments, and that's something that could change. And like, I don't know, Pope Francis very much could come out or the leadership and say, okay, this is something that we're going to allow. It's not like something that is out of the realm of possibility. I don't think it's probably what's best, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know what in time could happen. Nothing can change or things could change. I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, all I know is that these men that have made this calling, like to be priests, they also knew, and we're getting into, they also felt a call to celibacy. So it's not like, oh, they suddenly now should just go off and get married that are priests if that were changed. It's like, no, they very much know what they're doing and that they're feeling this call. Um, but yeah, so I think I don't know, we'll see what happens. I don't think in our lifetime anything will change drastically.
That would be interesting. We would have to do an episode then.
Oh, dang, I know. Yeah. What will never change, and this is something that Catholics think can change, is that women becoming priests. And that is something that is
Mm.
a doctrine, like a doctrine. I don't really think it's been dogmatically pronounced.
Hmm.
I'd be wrong. But it's a doctrine. That's something that like cannot change. Within the very nature of the office of the priesthood. Female deacons of some sort potentially could be a thing, but the office of the priesthood is just for men, which is to the dismay of Catholics sometimes, I think.
I feel like
On that
most people are on that side, but
Yeah, that's something we haven't talked about specifically. It's something I'm kind of honestly a little scared to talk about.
yeah, the role of women in the church. Ooh, I've had
We're
quite
being
the journey on
elevated in the
that
Catholic
because I have
Church.
changed denominations so many times.
Yeah,
So I different perspectives, I would say. But yeah,
yeah.
I think that's similar in like at least I know in the LCMS, like women cannot be pastors, but they can be deacons, and they can have different roles in the church. But yeah, not pastor.
Mhm. Yeah, that would be an interesting episode because that's something like what can change in the Catholic Church, which is just discipline wise, like women's different roles in the church, where I do think they've been unjustly prohibited because of like the culture and such, like not really a theological thing. But Pope Francis is now having more women in the Vatican and having that female voice, which I think is important. Some Catholics would disagree on that, but we can disagree on that.
That's allowed.
So yeah, I don't know. That's something also I think we could maybe see change, but I don't think it's going to be as drastic as people want. But yeah, I hope this was for people that wanted this episode. I hope this was a good conversation and maybe you got more clarity, whatever side you're on. And yeah, see what episodes we come up with in the future. I think we had talked about, oh, angels. That was something we
Yeah.
maybe we're gonna do. Yeah, so
Hmm.
that'll be a very interesting one. I don't know much about angelology, as they would call it.
Yes.
There's a lot we don't know about the angels and that we just kind of guess, honestly. Or we just kind of like, well, you can believe this, but it's not really, we don't really know.
Yep. Yeah.
That will be an interesting one. Let us know if you have any questions about that.